My name is James Darby. I'm a political campaign organiser and I've done it all my life. I've made it my life's work to a large extent. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to explain to you as quickly as I can how to vote and how to value your vote for freedom. I did write a 10,000 word document titled Value Your Vote, and I have done a number of videos which explain the voting system and the perfectness of the preferential voting system. What I'm going to do now is make it very brief in the hope of promoting you to see those videos I've done and to read the 10,000 word document titled Value Your Vote. The very best system of voting in the world is called the exhaustive voting system. The exhaustive voting system is when you have, say you've got 5 candidates standing and the ballot is taken. The candidate with the lowest vote is excluded and a new ballot is taken. 4 candidates. The lowest candidate is excluded and now there's 3 candidates until you get down to 2 candidates and the one with the highest vote wins. The reason that's impractical in a federal election or a state election is because we fortunately allow more than 2 candidates. And if there's 5 candidates standing in a federal seat or a state seat, the preferential voting system, which is wrongly named, it's not compulsory to vote, it's compulsory to take a ballot paper. What's perfect about the preferential voting system is when every box requires a number for the vote to be valid. The exhaustive system is the long arm of the preferential voting system. The preferential voting system saves having 5 elections. You have 1 election and you use the exhaustive system by preferencing. And you preference last the person you like the least, and you preference 1 the person you like the most. What's vital now in the coming federal election is to understand the power of your vote, and your vote doesn't die. It's called majority view democracy. Right now, to explain the preferential voting system simply, if you have 100 people voting and 1 person gets 35% of the vote, and 1 person gets 32% of the vote, and 1 person gets 33% of the vote, one should ask the question, who's entitled to win? Is it the 35% person? The trouble is, the 35% person wants to keep electoral funding. Electoral funding costs Australian taxpayers around about $100 million a year to pay candidates cash money for the votes they got. 1 candidate likes it because he's got a big party. The other 2 candidates don't like it because they consider it a rob against taxpayers. 1 got 32%, 1 got 33%. If they preference each other, they've got a total of 65% against the 35%. So who should win the election? The 35% of the minority view or the 65% of the majority view? That's the perfectness of preferential voting. And what's so important now in the fight for freedom that's taking place is that we ensure that the candidates who preference Greens last, Labor second last and Liberals third last all are voted for before the others who don't. If we're going to have a free party, a freedom candidate who is going to restore our freedoms and stop shutting us out from our family and from our livelihood and forcing us into a slave state, we've got to make sure that every person, every one of us understands when you're filling out your ballot paper, you go Greens last, Labor second last, Liberals third last in principle, and you preference from the top those 4 or 5 or 6 candidates who are all saying Greens last, Labor second last and Liberals third last. And you choose from those people and may the best man or woman win for freedom. In the process of becoming, firstly, a person concerned about the value of their vote and wanting their vote to count, a fascinating reason why a volunteer first goes to a campaign office is because they're thinking, I want to double my vote. I want to find someone that will help me increase the power of my vote by convincing other people to see the sense in the way I'm voting. And you can do that. You can do that by becoming aware of some aspects of some policy that you can become an expert in, so you can convince people of the importance of voting for the preservation of the family, voting for the preservation of the C person. The C, the SEE person, is the self-employed employer. They are the people who treat their employees like family. They treat their employees like apprentice employers, and they pass their knowledge, their wisdom, their skill onto their employee, so that one day that employee can become a self-employed person as well. That's got serious hamperings to it now, because successive governments know that the Labor Party's funded by union membership. They know that an employee of a self-employed employer rarely is in a union, because they're in the mode of learning what the boss knows, to learn how to treat a business as their own, to learn how one day to be self-employed and aspire to have the things that people want to aspire to have. A person who's employed by big government or by big union is in a union. By big government or by big business is in a union. And being in a union, they provide funds to the Labor Party. And the Labor Party is very interested in removing the competition for organisations like Coles and Woolworths, which was done remarkably well during the so-called milk wars. The milk wars were about destroying the corner shop, because the corner shop sold other things that Coles and Woolworths sold. One of the principal things they sold was milk. So Coles and Woolworths formed a duopoly and said, we're going to have a milk war. That's going to aid us as well, because we're going to rub out the small farmer who deals with us in a manner that's difficult for us to squeeze him lower. So we're going to rub the small milk producer out. In Richmond, which is the federal seat south of the border down around Byron Bay, before the milk wars, there were 70 dairy farmers, 70 dairy farming families whose sons and daughters either became dairy farmers or became other farmers, who had the love of the land in their soul and their blood. There's now 3 left. Coles and Woolworths rubbed out 67 families who were dairy farmers because they wanted to destroy the small dairy farmer through their lack of morality, lack of conscience, lack of decency, lack of honesty, which one can find in a small business person, because a small business person has the dignity of being their own name. They are identifiably the owner of the business, and so they are identifiably concerned about the moral and ethical conduct of their business. Coles and Woolworths don't have those assets to make them conduct themselves like a member of the human race. And they've done the same with a potato farmer, they've done the same with a table grape producer. Every single solitary small produce producer in Australia has been harmed and damaged by Coles and Woolworths. And at the end of the day, they're now sacking their staff. They're automating the loading of the shelves. They're automating the checkout chicks. No one working for Coles and Woolworths ever aspires to own their own business. And all those little corner stores that were shut by Coles and Woolworths because of the milk store may never be reopened. And the same applies to Bunnings and Dan Murphy. Bunnings has taken 6,000 businesses off the face of the earth in Queensland. That's 6,000 training grounds where the employee was the apprentice employer. And it's a heartbreak that a family business has been so attacked. We can start to turn this around, because we have to protect the essence of small business, the very backbone of Australia. And one of the reasons that the COVID was so excitedly accepted by the Labor governments of Australia was because they saw it as an added means of putting the small business person out of business, and so allowing big business and big government to absorb those employees into situations where they could never become self-employed people, into situations where they become entitlement focused, become Labor voters and become no asset to Australia from a wealth creation viewpoint, which means from a security viewpoint. We must have strong security. What's happening in Russia and the Ukraine now is a pure example of what we must do. In the course of your campaigning, it's very, very important to realise what happens when you come up against a Labor voter. A Labor voter is there and they have their reasons for voting Labor. And often they've forgotten the reason and they don't understand it anyway. So if the situation arises and they wonder where Australian manufacturing has gone, you can simply say, in 1972, a man called Gough Whitlam got elected as Prime Minister of Australia. The first thing he did was he sacked the consuls from Taiwan, Free China, and recognised Peking as mainland China. He confiscated 2 properties owned by Taiwan and changed the title into Peking's name. He redirected all mail going to Taiwan to go via Peking, and he changed the title of $2 million in Australian banks to the benefit of China. Fortunately, he only lasted 2 terms, both double disillusions, which is another story I'll say one day. Then a man called Keating became the Prime Minister, and Keating sent about with absolute malice aforethought to destroy Australian manufacturing and transfer it to China. And all the Labor voters had forgotten that 23 years before Gough Whitlam had become Prime Minister, the people who he recognised as China had murdered 1.6 million of the most gentle people on earth, the Tibetans. In 1949, they invaded Tibet and killed 1.6 million people. 23 years later, we congratulated them for killing millions of their own people and 1.6 million Tibetans. And then we said, the Labor government said, we're going to make sure that the communist system in China works. We're going to shut down all Australian manufacturing that we possibly can. We're going to transfer it to China. And then when Rudd and Gillard come along, we're going to sell 10 million hectares of Queensland arable land to China. They sold a bit to Hong Kong, but Hong Kong was always going to fall because we accepted a lease that had become invalid. Hong Kong should never have gone back to China because the China people that did the lease for Hong Kong were not the same China people that took the lease over. Questions? Electoral funding, a lot of people don't know, when you go to vote in the Senate or in the House of Representatives, you're actually paying the person you're voting for. A total in the federal election of $84 million, last federal election, plus about $15 or $16 million in admin, because every candidate gets a cheque for every vote they've got if they've got above 4%. You have to get 4% of the ballot in order to get the money. Now, it doesn't matter whether you won the election or you didn't win the election, you still get the 4% income. So if you've got 30,000 votes and you've come in second and someone else has got 40,000, you still get paid the 30,000 votes, which is $90,000. It's a lot of money to pay a candidate who's standing for Parliament. The argument for it was that a political party shouldn't accept donations, and a political party should be able to exist without donations, and all donations should be declared. That in itself is an absolute hypocrisy when the Labor Party says it, because the Labor Party organises the unions and the unions provide millions of dollars of funds to the Labor Party. When it comes to a land developer buys a paddock without sewerage, without roads, without water, without electricity, without foundation, and he plans it and he builds houses on it and he sells them. It's the council that approves that development. What the Labor government in Queensland did was they said, we are going to abolish developers donating to the state parliament. Now, the reason a developer donates to the state parliament is the developer is in the business of selling land title deeds. To sell a land title deed, he has to have a property to sell, and he has to have people with the financial capacity to buy the land title deed, to buy the house, to buy the unit, to buy the 5 acres, to buy 2 blocks of land so they can build on one and profit from the sale of the other. So by banning the developer, what they've done is they've banned the income that goes to a conservative style of party that believes in land title and home ownership and small business ownership. They're destroying that capacity of that party to raise the funds to run a campaign when the person donating is donating to preserve an enterprise society that creates the wealth for that developer to sell land title deeds. Without the wealth, there's only social housing. The real crime of social housing is a person that is a tenant renting a housing commission house never puts a swimming pool in, doesn't put a front fence in, doesn't change their carport to a garage, doesn't air condition it, doesn't put fly screens on it in most cases, doesn't recarpet it, doesn't paint it, doesn't take the asbestos roof off it, doesn't put brick siding over the fibro. A land of tenanted housing commission houses is a land without a home improvement industry, without a finance industry, without an insurance industry, without a real estate industry, without all the other business that's associated with that, which Bunnings love because Bunnings put out the tiling business, Bunnings put out the specialised tools business, Bunnings put out the carpet tile business person, the lawnmower repair shop, the nuts and bolts seller. Bunnings put out of business all those hardware shops which grew in Liverpool in particular, which is the study, the Green Valley area of Sydney, which consisted of about 8 suburbs, Heckenberg, Sadleir, Busby. They were all housing commission houses. And in about 1968, the government said, you're paying $40 a week rent. That $40 a week, we're going to compute it to a mortgage payment. In 20 years, you're going to own the property at $40 a week. Green Valley started flower power in Sydney. It started the brick siding where you could put bricks on the side of your house and pretend that wasn't fibro. They started the swimming pool industry. The landscaping industry went mad because the people who were tenants now got a job because they wanted to improve the house that they lived in. The home improvement industry went bananas in Liverpool. 5,000 houses nearly were converted from tenants to home ownership. So a person that wants to attack home ownership as a way of life has to be, for all intents and purposes, a socialist. And that's what the Labor Party is. The Labor Party and socialism around the world has had an enormous impact for an enormous long time because socialists are incredibly adept at infiltrating non-socialists. Julia Gillard, when she was at university, was the chairman of an organisation whose sole purpose, their charter was to find dedicated communists to get them to join the Labor Party. In 1932, another far-off example, a man called Stalin conscripted all the farmers' sons in the Ukraine and in Georgia and sent them to die invading Finland. Around about 600,000 Soviet troops died, 28,000 Finns died. When that terrible short war was over, unsupplied freezing troops in Finland died. Stalin then moved into the Ukraine in a historical event called the Holodomor. And in that Holodomor, between 7 and 10 million Ukrainians died of starvation and illnesses associated with starvation. What happened was Stalin sent his troops into the Ukraine and removed all the animals, all the pets, emptied all the larders, removed all the silos of their seed, and left the population with only themselves and bark to eat. And it did take around about 8 months for millions of people to die. Now, that's 1932-33. It's now 2022. It's a long time later. But what happened with the corpses of the 7 to 10 million Ukrainians? Stalin poured Russians into there. It's now really a Russian land. And that's the crisis that Ukraine faces, because Russians and Ukrainians were different people. They were like the Hungarians and the Czechs. They're different people. They're a different culture. They have a different language. They have different customs. They have a different folk dress. They have a different dance. They cook differently. They've got their own beautifulness of being a race, the perfectness of a race with your own border around yourself, your own flag and your own divinity and your own capacity to have your own free future, destroyed by Stalin and, of course, by the Democrat President Truman, who at the end of World War II said Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Romania, Bulgaria, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Eastern Germany all belonged to Stalin. And the American Democrats gave 260 million people into slavery, including the Ukrainians. He did a buy-off with Tito. He said to Tito, Stalin said to Tito, you get me $90 million a year aid and you can run Slovenia, Croatia, Herzegovina, Kosovo, Bosnia. You can have those countries, and the $90 million in aid that Truman agrees to give you, you pass it over to me. So that's how Tito stayed there for a while, until finally the Yugoslavia of Europe became all free countries. And of course, we've got our own Yugoslavia of Asia on top of us. We've got Indonesia, who the Islamic State of Indonesia invaded with the blessing of another Democrat president, West Papua. In West Papua, they've killed 400,000 blacks since 1960. In the last 2 years, they've killed 130,000. So socialism creeps everywhere, and socialism has no doubt crept into the Australian Liberal Party. That doesn't mean to say that the Australian Liberal Party, the Liberal Party of Australia, is a bad party. It means to say it's infected. That's why they're third last. That's why the Labor Party is second last, because the Labor Party are not the strict Marxists that 82% of the Greens are. About 18% of the Greens people are good people. They're voting Greens for the animals, for the environment. They're voting Greens because they're vegan, like myself. Or they're voting Greens because they want to insult their own dignity. But 18% are okay, and 82% are Marxists. And a Marxist doesn't believe in home ownership. The Greens, if they ever gain government, they would remove inheritance. They'd remove land title, because why should some person own a house and some person not? So the Greens are last because they're Marxists. The Labor Party are second last because they're socialist and will destroy small business, what's left of it. And the Liberals are third last because whatever happens, if the Freedom candidates are not motivated to save themselves as they could, we are going to be hopefully only stuck with Liberal and not with Labor. I believe that if sufficient people who are stepping out of the woodwork now, including the thousands, the hundreds of thousands that attended Canberra and other freedom rallies, the border rallies here, these people, if they say, I'm excited about being at the campaign, now I'm going to get excited about multiplying and duplicating, replicating my vote. I'm going to encourage my neighbour to understand we must preserve small business, we must preserve the small business employer, we must protect the small business employer and their employees against the impost of big business and big government. And to do that, you've got to persuade your neighbour to vote Greens last, Labor second last and Liberals third last. And to do that, it's not difficult. You live in a street. However many people are in your street, appoint yourself the street rep for that street. Find a Freedom candidate that's standing and say, I'm happy to hand out for you. I'm happy to hand out in my street. I won't door knock, but I'll walk my street, because we're not door knocking because of the COVID. We don't want to frighten people you don't know. If you know someone in the street, you can certainly door knock on them because you've been in their house before. In your street, you meet your friends and you become neighbourly in your street, and you determine which way your neighbour's going to vote, and you help them, you convince them, you help them save themselves, and you help them save Australia by getting them to understand they've only got to vote one for the candidate that says Greens last, Labor second last and Liberals third last, because the how to vote card displays the very soul of the candidate. If they've got Marxists last, you know they don't like Marxism. If they've got Labor second last, you know they don't like socialism. And if they've got Liberals third last, you'll know they prefer the Freedom Party that's going to make sure Australia survives on a defence mechanism by the creation of enough wealth and having electricity prices at such a stage that what's left of Australian manufacturing doesn't desert itself to China. So with electoral funding, when you've got all those public servants figuring out, did this guy get 4%, did that girl get more than 4%, oh, they're going to get so much a vote, which is indexed. So every time inflation goes up, the cash paid to a candidate goes up. So what happens is, when it's all over and said and the government's formed and they elect the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister chooses the Cabinet, they're starting already to campaign for the next election for the money. Gillard called an early election because her party was a bit down on funds. The early election, she called it about 4 months early. So if every federal election cost the federal government $100 million in payments to the candidates, imagine what it costs them to print the electoral rolls, to set up the polling booths, to employ the people to count the votes. The huge cost of a federal election is phenomenal. Now, it's supposed to go for 3 years, cut 4 months off it. The extra expense was around about 70 or 80 million by not having an election to full term. And an enormous amount of money went to the Liberal Party, enormous amount of money went to the Labor Party, and 1 year, way back, $6 million went to Pauline Hanson. She got 1.1 million votes. She took $6 million out of the Labor Party and the Liberal Party cash cow. She was milking. So what happened was, a man called John Howard said to a man called Tony Abbott, go get her. So Tony Abbott, with a legal team, prepared the case against Pauline Hanson, and the State Labor Party of Queensland executed the case and charged her, found her guilty, and popped her into jail. In jail, Pauline Hanson gets the victim complex. The victim complex soon grows into the revenge complex. And revenge for some people can never, ever be cured. And Pauline Hanson, unfortunately, is one of those people. She was never able to forgive and forget, or to forgive or to forgive at any level. So Pauline Hanson gets out of jail, and I do have to say, to row my own boat, I did help get her out of jail. I had my big Free Pauline Hanson t-shirt on. Another story. So Pauline Hanson gets out of jail, and the Australian population is behind her like nothing on earth. I figured that she'd triple her vote from 1.1 mil to 3.3 mil in Australia. I didn't figure on the revenge. Pauline Hanson gets out, and the first election, she says, She says the most inane, naive and stupid political statement ever made by any Australian politician, with a possible exception of Colin Barnett, ever. She said, vote the sitting member last. So she was asking me, a Conservative, if I lived in a Conservative seat, she was asking me to put Labor 1. She was asking a Labor voter to put Liberal 1. She said, put the sitting member last. She did that out of pure malice aforethought. Malice against the Labor Party candidate, against the Liberal Party politician, against the Labor Party politician. She did that because she thought, I'm so popular, I've just served 4 months in jail, I've just been released exonerated, I am the country's pet, I will get even more votes because I'm going to say vote the sitting member last. I told her message after message, you'll halve your vote. I got it wrong a little bit because I didn't allow for the sympathy vote for her because she'd been jailed unjustly. I didn't take into account the huge grey army that she had. They were called the Grey Army. They used to walk the streets with iron short sleeve shirts, creases down the arms here, and iron boxer shorts and Bermuda socks and runners, and with their Panama hats on, and all their wives carrying handbags like the Queen. And they'd march the streets with their signs in the most fantastic, enthusiastic manner, the Grey Army. When she said vote the sitting member last, the women all got a clutch handbag. The men didn't iron their shirts anymore, they got T-shirts. She destroyed the hopes and aspirations of thousands and thousands of Australians, and she nearly halved the vote. She virtually halved the vote. When she saw that wasn't working, she thought she'd try something differently, and she produced the split ticket, which was a two-sided how to vote card, 2 how to vote cards. If you're a Labor voter, vote this card. If you're a Liberal voter, vote that card. Now, she's reduced her vote in Queensland to 7%. The previous state election, it was 14%. She's halved a vote again. She needs 14.29% to get into the Queensland Council as a senator. It's her eighth year, so she's got 6th year, whatever it is. And she has to get 14.29% of the vote to get a quota to enter the council, to enter the state senator for Queensland. And I don't believe she'll get it unless she abandons the split ticket. The crime of the split ticket is the candidate who has it doesn't have the courage of conviction to say who they're going to support into government if they win. So the person going to vote for them doesn't know who that person's going to support into government. If you as a candidate can't declare your how to vote card to be identical to the way you as the candidate are personally voting, you have to be accused of hypocrisy. You have to be accused of a second agenda. And what's more, you have to be accused of being an abject fool, because the people who would normally have helped you, had you preference Labor if the socialists wanted to help you, or had you preference Liberal if the non or anti-socialists wanted to help you, they won't help you. Neither side will help you because you don't have the courage to declare whose side you're on. Joh Bjelke-Petersen once said a very famous thing. He said, know what side of the fence you're on. Otherwise, you'll be walking down a barbed wire fence with a foot on each side. So Joh Bjelke-Petersen. And he was right. Know what side of the fence you're on. So as a person that may make that step and say, I'm going to make sure my vote gets expanded, my vote gets compounded, the way to do that is described in my other 2 videos, in other videos I've done. It's also described in the document I wrote titled Value Your Vote. I started writing it on August the 31st or thereabouts, and at the time I didn't have a computer for some reason. I wrote it with the thumb on my phone, 10,000 words. And it's a description of how you become a political advocate, how you can influence votes. Any person that you recruit with what you learn from it will recruit one person a week compounded. As a street rep in your own street, working your own street, every week you'll recruit one person to vote your way, compounded, if you train them with how you're doing it. That description is described in my document titled Value of Vote. It's also described in those videos. It's also described by many of the freedom parties that I've managed to convince to start to recruit street reps. To win with street reps, a street rep should be there for 10 weeks because that's 10 votes. And if you're starting from nowhere, you need those 10 votes. But those 10 votes become compounded as the truth gets out. And there isn't a person in Australia who doesn't understand the small business owner is the backbone of Australia. They're the people from which the family is protected. They're the people that train their employees how to become self-employed. They're the people who pay tax. And they pay tax in many instances to the detriment of Australia because the struggle that they go through to pay the tax, the GST and the compulsory super and the unfair dismissal and all the other raft of taxes that successive governments have put into place to destroy the small business in favour of Bunnings, Coles and Woolworths, means that many small business employees see the anguish that the socialist governments have put the small employer through, and they're starting to think, I can never go into business, I can't handle this. Fancy employing someone you can't sack. I don't want to become self-employed. So that's another way that the socialists attack Australia. We were, till a few years ago, 70% employees were employed by self-employed employers. Self-employed employer being the person who's identifiable as owning the business and conducting the business in an honest and honourable way. Something that Coles and Bunnings and Woolworths have never, ever done. So buy small business, vote small business, and don't only vote small business, get others to vote small business as well. And find out how if you don't know how. Go to any small party that says Greens last, Labor second, Liberals third last, and say, I'm here to help. What you're really saying to them is, I'm here to multiply the way I vote. I'm here to get other people to vote my way. And you can do it. If you don't do it, we've lost Australia.